Hello everyone, welcome to our Module 4 lecture video. Today we're going to be talking about speech anxiety, the phrase I've been throwing around, which is communication apprehension, and how we deal with this very normal anxiety or a little bit of fear surrounding giving presentations or even different situations involving communication. And so first things first, I want you to know that it's very normal and common to deal with a little bit of fear and anxiety, and it can even be a really good thing. It can help you stay focused and enthusiastic in a presentation, and so I don't want you to shy away from this. This is a time for some self-reflection. Pretty much everyone I know experiences a little bit of anxiety when it comes to giving a presentation, including myself. So we'll go ahead and jump in and talk about some ways to manage that anxiety. So first, an overall definition of communication apprehension, which is just a person's level, degree basically, to which that fear and anxiety affects them. And so the important part of this specific definition on the screen right now is talking about the real or anticipated communication with another person. So let me give you a little bit of clarification for what we mean by real or anticipated. Real is referring to a communication event that is happening in the moment. So let's say you're giving a speech and you feel that fear and anxiety right then. That would be an example of real communication in this context. The next is anticipated. And so basically what I wanted to clarify is this anticipated fear is not any less real. That is just the way that Dr. Mikrowski and Dr. Richmond wanted to describe this, but anticipated communication just means you experience that fear and anxiety before that real conversation or presentation happens. So it's not any less real at all. It just does not happen in real time. And these can be coupled together. They're not mutually exclusive. So you can have anticipated communication apprehension and real or live communication apprehension. So an example of anticipated communication with another person would be, let's say you're going to have a meeting or a conversation with your boss and you experience some levels of fear and anxiety. That still counts as communication apprehension, even though it's not maybe in the moment and maybe the meeting or conversation goes really well and you're not nervous at all during that. This still falls under the same category. So if you have any questions about that, just let me know, but we'll go ahead and move on. So here's some statistics, again, just to make you feel like a normal person who experiences things just like everyone else does, but 20% of the general population suffers from higher levels of communication apprehension, and this is overall. So this is pertaining to different kinds of situations, contexts. We are not just talking about public speaking here. Studies have shown that a fear of public speaking is much greater than just 1 in 5. This is just talking about overall higher levels of communication apprehension in different situations. So even then, 1 in 5 is still a really large number of people that experience overall higher levels of communication apprehension. And like I said, those public speaking numbers are higher. So don't feel weird or like you're different if you experience this. Most people do, including myself. And so just keep that in mind as we go through the different types of communication apprehension. There are 4 that these researchers have found and discussed in their findings, and they're all different. So you may have one or not the other. You may have all 4, as we'll talk about in the first, but these are different kinds, but you can experience multiple kinds at once. So the first kind of communication apprehension is called trait-based or trait-like communication apprehension. And so what I want you to know about this, after reading the definition of course, is that this has to do with the individual experiencing the communication apprehension themselves. So this has to do with something about their personality type, that they are just generally oriented to not liking or having an apprehension towards different kinds of communication. So this spreads across a wide variety of contexts, different kinds of audiences or people they're talking to, different situations. Trait-like really means that the person themselves is experiencing communication apprehension in a lot of different settings. And so this is actually important to note, the least common type of communication apprehension. So if you're thinking, oh no, it's in my DNA that I don't like communicating or talking to people, it's actually probably not. It's probably one of the other three types of communication apprehension that you're experiencing, but it is possible that it is a part of your personality that you are apprehensive towards a lot of different kinds of communication. So that is the first one. Let's go ahead and move on. Next is context-based. And so context-based can get confused with the rest of the following two. So be very careful to pay close attention to my examples in this section, as well as the next couple of slides. But context-based is the enduring personality type orientation towards communication in a given context. So that seems confusing, but don't let personality type confuse you here. The trait-based really has to do with, remember, the individual themselves. Context-based is based on where the individual is. It's based on communication settings and things like that. So let me give you some examples. Let's say that you really hate going to parties with a lot of people because it makes you feel anxious or uncomfortable. You just really have an apprehension towards communicating in that environment. That would be an example of some context-based communication apprehension. Public speaking also falls under context-based because it is the context in which you're speaking. Maybe you have some fear and anxiety surrounding speaking in front of a large group of people. Another example would be maybe you hate talking to people one-on-one. That might make you nervous or uncomfortable. All of these fall under context-based. So you might experience one context that you really just hate communicating in. Maybe it's public speaking, maybe it's parties like I talked about. It obviously doesn't have to be all contexts, but you find specific contexts that you do not generally enjoy speaking in. So that would be context-based. Again, not to be confused with audience-based. So again, remember, trait-based had to do with the individual personality, context-based had to do with the communication surroundings, and audience-based has to do with who you're talking to or who you're speaking to. So maybe you experience real or anticipated communication apprehension when you're going to talk to maybe a doctor or a group of doctors. Maybe for some reason that group of people or that audience intimidates you and gives you fear and anxiety. So this is just generally talking to a certain group of people. Maybe for some reason you find it really fear-inducing to talk to an age group, maybe older people or younger people. You just really have an apprehension of communicating with a certain audience or a certain group. So again, this doesn't have to necessarily be an audience. You don't have to be giving a presentation per se. This can be one-on-one. This just has to do with maybe you are apprehensive to communicating with a certain type of person or group of people. So like I said, lawyers or doctors, so it can do with their profession, or it can be a certain age group, or even a certain gender, something like that. It makes you nervous. And so that would be audience-based communication apprehension. And finally, I think this is the most confusing because it can get mixed up with context a lot. But the last type of communication apprehension is situational. So this is a transitory orientation, which means that it's not consistent toward a communication with a given person or group of people. in a response to situational constraints. So this is really, what I want you to think about as situational is it's not enduring. So the past three we talked about is, like for context, you're always afraid of public speaking. Or for audience-based, you're always afraid of communicating with doctors. For situational, this would be completely random. Maybe you've never experienced communication apprehension with giving a presentation before, but maybe this certain presentation, maybe you have to present a really important project or your thesis or something like that, and that gives you a lot of communication apprehension or fear and anxiety. And so that would be described as situational. Me, for instance, like when I was presenting my thesis for my master's degree, that was a situational context that gave me a lot of anxiety and fear and communication apprehension. But it's not enduring. I don't experience communication apprehension when I'm talking to that group of people normally. I mean, it's some of my favorite professors, and I wouldn't feel that pressure if I wasn't doing something important. So that was a situational constraint that added or created that situational communication apprehension. So what to remember about situational is that it's completely random. Based on situational constraints, it's not enduring, while trait and context and audience are all things that endure and persist. They're pretty common to a person. So if you have any questions about needing clarification about that, again, just let me know. So what you're going to do in this module is take, if you might already have, you might be doing that after this video, but is to take the PRCA. And so this is a way to measure your level of communication apprehension. They actually have 4 separate subgroups for different types of communication situations, like we just talked about. And so this gives you an overview of you're going to take that test, and it's basically a personality kind of test to see where you fall on the communication apprehension scale. And so these numbers, if you want to screenshot this, I think it also has it on that sheet. This will show you what PRCA score you have. So low down here, and this is the overall score, and this would be for the subgroup. This would mean that you don't have very much communication apprehension, you don't have very much fear or anxiety communicating with people overall. And on the opposite end of that spectrum, this would be you have high levels of communication apprehension, meaning that you experience a lot of fear and anxiety overall in lots of different situations and communication contexts. And these would be for different subgroups. So for me personally, I have a pretty moderate amount or moderately low amount of communication apprehension overall, but I have a moderately high amount of communication apprehension in some subgroups. So you might be able to, again, do some self-reflection and see, oh, I might really struggle with public speaking. Okay, I might have a moderately high score there, and you can just see where you fall along the scale overall. So that's an assignment for you guys. I hope it helps you a little bit to frame what your strengths and maybe what you struggle with a little bit when it comes to managing anxiety, speech anxiety, and things like that. Which brings me to how we're going to manage that speech anxiety. It's never necessarily going to go 100% away. I know a lot of you talked about this in your goals. You talked about wanting to be able to manage this, have confidence, and I think that's great. And there are so many ways to do that. And the first one we're going to talk about in here is to reframe your thoughts. And so the first thing to do, like I talked about at the beginning of this lecture, is to accept a moderate amount of nervousness. You can tell yourself, okay, it's good to be nervous in this situation. It means I care. It means that it's going to give me a drive to do well. And so everyone is a little bit or a moderate amount nervous, especially. So learning to accept that actually tricks our brain into being less nervous. It's a weird psychology thing. And so accepting that you're going to be a little nervous and accepting that it might actually help drive you is a really good first step to having that confidence. And second is to focus on your audience and your topic, not on yourself. And so a lot of times we are thinking about how the audience perceives us. Oh my gosh, what do I look like? What do I sound like? And that can get really in our heads really quickly. And we lose focus on the message, which is the most important part of our speech. We lose focus on connecting with the audience, which is definitely the most important part of our speech. Next to the message is connecting with that audience, engaging with them. And you do have to think about yourself a little bit with eye contact and your gestures, but getting too much in our heads about that will lose that naturalness and audience connectedness. So a good thing if you're stressed out or nervous, focus on the topic, focus on being passionate about your topic, and look at your audience members. Even in this mediated space, we can look at each other's videos and connect with each other, even if we're not in the same room. And so that's really helpful, I think, when we're struggling with communication apprehension. And then thirdly on this is think rationally about your goals. So let me tell you, no presentation is going to ever be perfect. This presentation or lecture is not perfect at all. And so try and destroy that myth in your mind that the presentation has to be perfect and that it's the end all be all and that it's the end of the world if you don't do well. It definitely doesn't have to be perfect, and I, as the person who will be grading your speeches, do not have the expectation that you will be perfect, nor should you be. A little bit of human error or vocal fillers like ums and uhs, a little bit of those actually makes you seem more natural and more human, which helps you connect with your audience. So those things can be good. Myth number 2 is that you can entertain every listener. So again, not everyone is going to be interested in what you're talking about. And while you should try and engage with different kinds of people in your audience, not everyone is always going to be engaged. And that is not on you. That is not your fault. A lot of times, remember we talked about external and internal noise. So maybe a listener is dealing with some internal noise, like hunger, or they're tired, and that's not on you to entertain them. So just know that you can practice strategies to engage listeners, but you're not going to make everyone happy. And finally, the third myth is that the worst will happen. So no one in my class has ever died or passed out or anything from giving a speech. And so, I think the worst being that you would die or something from giving this, and that will never happen. So kind of back to what I said before is that this is not the end of the world. This is not the end all be all. Please put in perspective that this is one class out of many, many classes you will take in college. And while I do think it'll be really helpful and beneficial to every single one of you, giving a bad presentation is not the end of the world. I do think you should practice and do the best that you can, but the worst, you won't die. So just thinking about these things will help you ease that anxiety. Which brings me to what I just said, is to practice and prepare. So the number one thing to help you prepare for your speeches is just to do them over and over again, because you get comfortable with yourself and how you're going to say things. So start working on your presentations early as you can, as soon as the modules open up for those. Start planning things out, writing outlines. Get feedback from me if you want to send me your work to see how you outline your speeches, or your friends or people in the class early. Send that early, and I will respond early before you actually give your presentation. And so practicing on your feet before a small audience. So this is again for our in-person classes. You obviously do not have to be standing necessarily for these speeches, but you can be. It gives you confidence. You can have your shoulders back, have good posture, and things like that. It is good to practice in front of a small audience because you will have an audience for these, even though it's a mediated space. Aim for a conversation, not a performance. So like I've talked about before, we encourage conversational, extemporaneous speaking as opposed to robotic reading off of a manuscript or trying to have every single word memorized. You're not here to perform for us. You're here to persuade and inform us about whatever it is you're speaking about. And so a conversational speaking style will always connect better with an audience. So be practicing that as well. Okay, and always, always, always practice it until you can deliver it without relying on your notes. And again, just like I said, this does not mean reading from a manuscript or trying to memorize a manuscript. You do not have to have every word for word memorized. It's okay to have notes, but you should be able to deliver it without relying on them. So not without using them. Please still use them, but without reading off of them and having to go back and be like, oh, what's my next main point? You should really have an idea of what your main points are before you start speaking. Okay, and then on a speech day, this is again good for any kind of presentation, not just for us. It's good, get a good night of sleep and have a good breakfast. You don't want that communication apprehension making your stomach hurt, so settling it with food is always good. Try to move a bit before speaking so you don't shake or have a lot of pent-up energy that you get out in nervous ways or ways that are not natural. So go ahead and try and, I don't know, maybe do some jumping jacks or go for a run to kind of get out those nerves. Avoid caffeine or carbonation and alcohol and anything else that would impair your ability to have a good presentation. So again, everyone knows caffeine will make you jittery and again, shake a little bit, so try to avoid that. Dress professionally, I've already laid out these standards for you all, but just coming in a way that makes you feel proud to give your presentation and not sloppy or in inappropriate clothing. And then last but not least, I think is really important is to visualize and speak positively to yourself. So again, in this module, there's videos for you to watch that are super encouraging, TED Talks and things like that, about how to visualize yourself doing well, about giving yourself positive affirmation. I definitely believe in the power of positive thinking, and self-fulfilling prophecy is actually a theoretically not proven, but really supported hypothesis that if you tell yourself good things, then good things or better things will happen than if you tell yourself, oh, I'm going to suck at this presentation. You have definitely a higher chance of not doing as well than if you tell yourself, hey, I'm going to do great. And even if I don't, it's not the end of the world, but I believe that I can do this. And so those are all ways to help manage your communication apprehension. And if you have any questions about the information in this module, send me an email and I will be happy to help. But I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and I will see you at our next video conference.